Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of the
We Got It podcast.
The We Got It podcast is an official podcast of Spartans Illustrated, which is your home for all things Spartan athletics. They're constantly posting articles, game recaps, quote posts, press conference articles, like just everything you could possibly want. And not just for men's basketball and football. As you can tell if you've been tuning in, we've been super getting into like women's basketball this season, hockey, the women's gymnastics team. And it has been an absolutely dominant week for Spartan sports, which we'll get into more later. But if our, 30, 45 minutes of Spartan content is not quite enough for you, be sure to head over to Spartans Illustrated. And you might see our names popping up there every once in a while. We enjoy guest writing for them as well.
Absolutely. And as always, if you're listening, we appreciate the support. We'd love to continue to get this podcast out to more and more Spartan fans. So every time you hit like, you follow us on Spotify or YouTube, interact with us on social media, it helps spread out to more and more Spartan fans throughout the country, throughout the world. So always appreciate your support.
Definitely, because the We Got It podcast is really for every Spartan fan. I think there are so many awesome athletic podcasts out there. There's so many different ways that you can kind of consume Spartan sports. We're not saying anything new under the sun, but I think something that we are really passionate about is helping Spartan fans, whether you're brand new and started following men's basketball this season, or you've been really getting into the men's hockey team, to feel like you can really like participate in conversations when it comes to sports, whether you're that new fan or you're somebody who's been following sports for years. And so I think we try to keep it real around here. Like sometimes, and today especially, we're going to get a little into the nitty gritty. We've got a special guest in Anthony Garvert. He's going to take us through Bart, Torvik, Ken Palm, all of the, if you don't know what any of those terms are, like all of the stats that go into determining the seeding for March Madness. We're super lucky and grateful to have him on. So make sure you stick around to the end of the episode. But whether you care about those sort of things to just like, hey, I kind of want to know what the stat lines were. And it's easy for me to regurgitate what Abby and Jonah said when I'm talking with my coworkers at work this week. Like if that's you, we're here for it. And like Jonah said, all of that interaction just helps more and more Spartan fans feel like we got it too. Welcome to the We Got It podcast,
a Michigan State sports podcast for everyone.
We're Jonah and Abby, a husband and wife who's probably a little too obsessed with Spartan sports.
And we want to share a little bit of that obsession with you, from casual fans
to die-hard bleed green fanatics.
And we want to make following Spartan sports easy, enjoyable, and engaging for everyone.
Go green!
We're here. We're back. Recapping another win for the men's basketball team this week. We're getting pretty comfortable with this kind of rhythm of breaking down these wins for the Spartans. Now 12 in a row after the 81-74 victory against Rutgers at kind of Michigan State's kryptonite, Madison Square Garden. How you feeling, Abby?
I am honestly just thrilled after that win. And I know that Tom might not agree. I know he said it was kind of the first time where he felt like maybe the guys came out looking a little entitled. But for what was considered a neutral court location, it really was a road game for the Spartans. I don't care how many tickets they sell to whoever. Like, Rutgers is from Jersey. You're playing at MSG. We historically have not the world's greatest record at Madison
There was
Square
a lot
Garden.
of red in there too.
Oh, absolutely. And it really wasn't until the end of the game when we had won that you finally heard, like, over the TV, some go green, go white chants. Like, it was loud for Rutgers that whole game. And so I will absolutely, we've said this before, I'm never going to apologize for a road win, and certainly not a, 10-point road win.
Yeah, not only is Michigan State 8-0 in Big Ten play, 12 wins in a row, but they have not lost this year on the road, which is
I really like the sound of that. We haven't lost this year.
We haven't lost. We're undefeated in 2025. We're undefeated since before Thanksgiving.
That is wild. And you know what's crazy? What as I was thinking about is we have another hopefully winnable matchup coming up against Minnesota on Tuesday at home. we haven't lost since we played Minnesota the last time. We haven't lost since before we played Minnesota the last time. And if I was Minnesota, I'd be shaking in my boots coming to East Lansing on Tuesday, because really, like, after their performance at Minnesota, how do you expect to come in and be the ones to put a stop to this role that the Spartans are on? Now, that doesn't mean we can get cocky. Those boys need to take that game seriously. I think it's really easy for any of these like so-called winnable games to start kind of like banking it and looking ahead to the next game, especially because the next game, while it is USC, it holds a lot of, weight of just like, we're going to the West Coast for the first time. And then it's easy to look past USC and look at UCLA.
Absolutely. And thinking about Minnesota on Tuesday, they're winners of 3 straight. They have wins against Oregon, against Michigan in that stretch. They're a lot hotter basketball team. And I think a lot different basketball team than when we faced them back in December. So this is not going to be an easy win by any means. Michigan State is going to have to bring their A game in order to get that win on Tuesday, to have back-to-back undefeated months.
So let's start with, reflecting on the game from Saturday against Rutgers. What do you feel like the Spartans need to continue to work on or even fix from that Saturday performance to be able to like go into this matchup against Minnesota strong? I know one of the things that we had kind of seen a theme was like the inability to guard the cut to the baskets from an off-ball player. How do you feel like they did against Rutgers with that? And what do you think we still need to continue to like make sure we're doing or work on moving into Minnesota?
Yeah, I mean, that was something that I didn't really see a whole lot of on Saturday, was kind of getting beat back door like we had seen against Illinois and Penn State, which I think was a good marked improvement for this team. But I kind of feel like Tom Izzo after the game kind of broke it down. Kind of how I was maybe feeling a little bit is, and I don't know if I would say quite as extreme as Tom Izzo said, but he kind of called his team fat and sassy.
Tom, extreme? Never.
So I would say maybe they looked a little complacent, like they should win the game. Kind of like they deserve to win the game, that they're their better team. And I think there's a good level of confidence to carry with yourself. But as we get now to really the stretch part of the season, a tough February, like you're 8-0 in the Big Ten, and everybody's chasing you. You're going to be getting every single team's very best shot now for the remainder of the season. So you have to come and try to find that chip on your shoulder going into these games. And I think obviously Rutgers kind of got off to like, I think an 8-point lead kind of early in that first half, but once Michigan State kind of gained control, a game that was never really in doubt throughout the game, kind of felt like Michigan State had control of. But I want to just continue to see Michigan State continue to have that aggression, that kind of Michigan State DNA, defend, rebound, run as they go into these next really 12 games of the regular season, because they're going to need to win games, and none of these games in Big Ten play are gimmies or easy.
Definitely not. And 12 games, that's a lot, because you're really fitting all of those in like a less than 40-day period. That's a lot of basketball that we have left to play. I think I would argue a little bit, and this is maybe where we can start getting into like transition from negatives to positives. I really felt like the fat and sassiness did come from our starters this week. Now, Jackson Kohler got a couple fouls early in the game. I think the kid only got about 10 minutes in the whole game, so we'll give Jackson a little bit of a break. But man, Rutgers just really shut down Jeremy Fears. He had his assist to turnover ratio really plummeted on Saturday. Jaden Akins really didn't do a whole lot until the second half. He scored 12 points. 4 of those were in the first half, 8 in the second half.
If you would have looked at just the box score from our starters, you would have been like, I don't know if we probably won this game. I think every single starter scored less than their season average, and they scored 31 points as a starting group. So obviously, as we get into some of these tougher games, we're going to need to see some better performances from those starters, from Jeremy Fears, from the bigs like Sapala and Kohler. I like to see Akins kind of get more involved. It seems like he's always ready for those last 8-10 minutes of the game. He kind of locks in, but kind of has some slower starts. But man, the bench really carried their weight and carried the team to victory on Saturday. I know Cohen Carr and Jace Richardson alone outscored the starting
all
5
of the starters. Let's just let that sink in for a second. Which, I mean, come on. Love Jace Richardson. Love Cohen Carr. I don't think we're ever going to stop singing their praises. I think it's a pretty easy decision. Like, player of the week this week has to go to Jace Richardson.
I think so, yeah.
Career high 20 points. He had, 4 or 5 assists as well, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Just coming in there and making it look easy. I think one of my favorite moments from him, and this just shows off, like, this mentality that we've talking about, is he has this ability to like slow down time and just stay so calm in the moment. He was I think it was maybe a little bit of a fast break play, but he drove to the hoop for a layup, got fouled on the way up, and he's literally kind of going straight under the basket, which I feel like is just such a hard spot to make a layup from. And as he's getting fouled, he somehow has like the presence of mind to just like hang in the air and slowly roll the ball up and over the front of the rim, which is just so challenging to do. And I think that's something that any other freshman who doesn't have the same level of control that he has, who doesn't have the same ability to read the court, like, yeah, they're probably getting the foul there and maybe getting 2 points at the line, but I don't think they're getting the and one. And I think that moment was just like, yes, this is Jace, and this is why we love Jace.
Yeah, and we're honestly running out of good things to say about both Jace Richardson and Cohen Carr. And we've kind of said throughout this whole season is he doesn't force things. He lets the game come to him. He's so controlled. He shoots when he needs to shoot, doesn't force anything. And we're kind of saying, wait till he actually has a game where he's not just shooting it 4 or 5 times, or he maybe shoots it 9 or 10 times. And we saw that on Saturday. He was 5 for 9, had 3 threes, scored 20 points, and really was the bread and butter for this team throughout the game against Rutgers.
And that's wild to me that he had 20 points off of 5 shots and couple free throws, 5, field goals.
Right.
Just wild. Like, what an insanely efficient kid, which is just not something you're used to saying about a true freshman, especially somebody who's not coming in as like already top 10 NBA draft level talent.
Right.
Like, he has just continued to knock everyone's socks off.
And it just continues to kind of drive this narrative that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks is how in the world do you prepare for this team? Because it seemed like early on, especially when Rutgers kind of jumped out to a lead, they were really wanting to put a lot of pressure on our guards. Like you said, Jeremy Fears kind of had a slower game. Akins had a slower game. Holloman had some nice moments, but compared to the last couple of games, had a quieter game. Like, they were putting their focus and energy on those players, it seems. But then when you get the second unit off the bench and Cohen Carr, Jace Richardson, Xavier Booker had I think one of his best games as a Spartan. Frankie,
we got to come back to that in a second.
Didn't have a ton of points, but rebounded the ball well, had a lot of assists.
For the amount of minutes that he was in, Frankie was wildly efficient.
Absolutely. And that bench squad, those 5 guys, really won us this game when our starters didn't, I would say, had maybe a passing grade, maybe like they were just completely average. I think nothing spectacular. They didn't necessarily play bad, but they weren't the ones kind of moving this offense forward.
But here's the thing. Our bench 5, if you think about it, you've got Jace Richardson, Frankie Fiddler, Cohen Carr, Xavier Booker, and Carson Cooper. If you leave out maybe Carson Cooper, that is not a bad starting 5. And I think that's the big thing of like, yes, on the one hand, I'm a little bit disappointed in our starters from Saturday, but like, I'm also not surprised that our bench is coming out and scoring 50 plus points. Like, we are just ad nauseum. Like, our team is so deep, and it's something that I will never stop being thankful for. I will say too, I want to give Jeremy Fears Jr. a little bit of like a break and a little credit. Like you said, they scouted us well, and it's interesting to see how like every team takes a slightly different tactic, right? Like against Illinois, you could tell they were absolutely just trying to shut down Jaden Akins. And then you could tell against Rutgers, they are trying to shut down our guard play because we do so well when we have 3 guards in. And from the get-go, I think it was like the first or second basket that Rutgers made, number 25, Williams, was all up in Jeremy Fears' face. As a Spartan fan, I felt like he deserved a technical. I mean, it was just like unsportsmanlike conduct.
Right.
He got a layup, goes back and just like gets up in Jeremy Fears' face. I mean, inches away, just taunting him, yelling at him. And Jeremy really had to deal with that all game. I mean, Williams was hanging off of his arm the whole time. Like, I do want to give a lot of credit to Jeremy. Like, that is a tough situation to get put in. And I think that he still handled it with a decent amount of grace.
And the thing with Michigan State is, like you said, it seems like every single team is taking a slightly different approach, because obviously they have to, because nothing so far has worked for any team. And because of that, it's not like Michigan State takes a while to kind of figure out, okay, now we got it. Like, they're just able to pivot so well and say, all right, if you're going to take Jeremy Fears and Jaden Akins away, let's bring in Jace Richardson and Cohen Carr and just blow your face off with those guys.
Absolutely. And I think Jace and Cohen, I love having them in at the same time, because the dynamic of what the Spartans can do when they're both in the game is so wildly different. We've talked about Jace's ability to just float and glide across the floor and slow things down. But then you have Cohen Carr, who is just absolute freak athleticism. You give him one step and you better get out of the way, son, because he's going to come across with a cockback dunk and just shove it down your throat. Like, it's so fun having both of them on the court. And I mean, Cohen Carr, he had 14 points, 8 rebounds. He just played phenomenally.
And he was the primary defender on Ace Bailey for Rutgers, who likely top 3-4 NBA draft pick next year, and really played really, really well
because we talk
against
about
him.
So much of Cohen's offensive ability and athleticism, but his ability to not only get defensive and offensive rebounds, but just his ability to defend. I think it's something that we've been taking for granted, or at least I do, just even watching games, of realizing like how rarely people get past him.
And I think too, I mean, Izzo said this after the game, it's something he's really improved on and worked on, like, pretty much every single element of his game this year, and even throughout this season. He just continues to improve on, and like we've talked about, just the presence of him on the court, even if he's not the one making the play, opens it up for other guys. I think it was the first half, there was a 2-on-1 fast break. It was Trey Holloman and Cohen Carr. They're so worried about Cohen Carr that he guarded Cohen Carr, even though Trey had the ball, and let Trey just have a wide open layup because of just that fear of getting that posterizing dunk that we all know that Cohen Carr is capable of doing any given moment.
And it's 2 points either way. I mean, yes, there's something electrifying about Cohen getting a dunk, but like you said, like a dunk or that Trey Holloman layup, it's 2 points.
Absolutely.
And it still gets the Spartans where we need to be, and I love it.
Yeah, I think it was one of Cohen Carr's best games. I think it was Jace Richardson's best game. We also haven't really talked about it, but I think Xavier Booker played really well too.
Exactly. That's where I was saying I need to circle back, because if you listen to last week's episode, I was pretty harsh on Xavier. You know, I really was like, hey, I think this kid needs an attitude check. He just did not seem into it. He did not seem like a team player when we were going against Illinois, which was just really surprising to me. And I think that's something that we have felt from Xavier Booker, or not even just this year, but definitely last year as well. And I think what I need to just start doing, honestly, and, you know, I'll take the heat for it. It's fine. Like, I need to start bashing these guys a little bit more. Our family group chat is notorious. It's always going off during Spartan basketball games. Sometimes we've been trying to do like phoneless Saturdays. And so I'll open my phone after a game and I've got like 60, 70 plus messages from my family. But, you know, I don't pull punches in that chat usually. And I have been, you know, a little hard on Frankie Fiddler, a little bit hard on Xavier Booker in that chat. And you know what? It seems like they have been on a mission to prove me wrong. And I am so happy to be proven wrong in that. Like, Xavier Booker just came out with a hustle that I haven't seen from him since earlier in the season. Really, I think since 2024.
Right.
Like, he just was going after it. One thing I would still love to see him do is, my son, you are 7 feet tall and have a 7 foot plus wingspan. Grab the ball with 2 hands. You know, that would be lovely to see. But just overall, like, his hustle, his ability to get to the hoop. I love that he's still taking threes. I think he was 0 for 3 from the 3-point line. Got all of his points within the arc. But, you know, just like the hustle from him was miles beyond where it was against Illinois.
Right. I mean, he had a nice pull-up jumper. He had a drive to the hoop where he got fouled on. He had an and one opportunity. So, like, I don't think he missed a 2-point shot on the game. Yeah. And I think he had 5 rebounds. But off the bench is that kind of production. Yes. And when he just has that little extra, just
That
like
drive.
grit, that
Yes.
drive. He's just a totally different player. And again, like he changes the momentum of a lot of these games when he kind of has these stretches. Sometimes it might be only be 3 or 4 minutes. Seemed like it was more than that on Saturday.
Absolutely.
But if we can get more 10, 12 of those minutes from him instead of 3 or 4, like it again just changes this team's ceiling. And we know how high the floor is of this team, obviously, because the starters, like we said, didn't play a great game. Still kind of controlled the game, was leading by double digits for most of the second half because of the bench. And we can continue to kind of get these performances out of Booker, out of Jace, out of Carr, and then our starters have a good game. Like the ceiling just continues to get higher for this team, I think.
And I think that's something that we're just unused to seeing, is that we feel like a lot of times in January, February, like, oh, we can see that the ceiling could be this high, but the floor is like all over the place. Versus it feels like the floor just keeps like maintaining or increasing, and we still just don't know where the ceiling's going to be. And that's why I'm excited for February. I think the trip out west is going to be very telling for us. I think 2 games against Michigan is going to be very telling for us. You know, I think they're a little overrated this year. That's because I've got a chip on my shoulder. But the rivalry games are never going to be something that is easy. And I think those are the times when you're going to see like the best Michigan State team come out outside of like the Big Ten tournament and the NCAA tournament. So much more to be excited about. It's another great week for Spartan basketball. I'm pretty happy with the guys, and I hope that we can continue to clean up those mistakes, continue to maintain that floor, and push that ceiling come Minnesota on Tuesday.
Yeah, I think looking back at this month of January, I think looking at the schedule, kind of going into it, like these are all winnable games. But I don't really think we thought that Michigan State was going to go undefeated.
You feel like you've got to like make some mistakes. So there's going to be a slip up on the road. Like I thought Ohio State was going to be a big challenge for us, which it was. I thought Illinois was going to be the straw that broke the camel's back, but the boys managed to pull out.
And now we are 1 win away at home against the Minnesota team that we blew the doors off of on the road. Like we said, having back-to-back undefeated months and going into February where there's probably going to be some losses, but being 9-0 in the Big Ten would be huge for this stretch run, like you said, where we play Michigan twice, we play Purdue, we play Oregon, we play Wisconsin, on the road against Maryland, who's played really well as of late.
On the road against UCLA, like all the
exactly.
Things. Yes.
So this is going to be a big stretch for Michigan State coming up, and I'm just glad that they're continuing to stack these wins in games where they're not necessarily having their A+ or even B+ performances out of their players.
And, you know, keeping in mind that we're going to have Anthony Garvert on later, you brought up a stat earlier today that I thought was really interesting of looking at like the past to help predict where the Spartans might go the rest of this season. The Spartans have started 2 seasons, 19-2. We're currently sitting at 17-2. That was in 2003 and 2014, correct?
2008 and 2014.
2008 and 2014. And then we started one other season, 18-2, which was the 2019-2020 season. And so, you know, all I'm saying is that if we pull out another win against Minnesota, we pull out a win against USC, we're hitting some pretty big stats that's reminiscing of some pretty important history. For the Spartans.
Thinking of some of the all-time best Spartan teams we're thinking of. And I don't necessarily think anybody going into this year thought that this would have a chance to be one of those teams that could be in that same kind of conversation with some of those teams that we've just had so much fun with. And obviously it's a long road ahead and they have to perform in February and March. But the fact that this team is in the place that they are now, number 8 in the country, now 17-2.
Yes.
With, again, like, obviously we have to travel to LA. Minnesota's not a game, but against games that we can win, like, the sky's the limit for this team, and I'm so excited for February, so excited for March. It's going to be a wild ride.
It's time for the We Got It halftime show now. And like we said in the intro, absolute dominance. We keep saying this from the Spartans this week across all sports. So why don't you get us kicked off with men's hockey?
Yeah, it was a massive series. This weekend at Munn Arena, number 2 Michigan State facing off against number 4 Minnesota. Teams number 1 and number 2 in the Big Ten standings. And the Spartans had a massive weekend coming off on Friday night with a just utterly dominant performance, scoring 9 goals against the Gophers, coming away with a 9-3 victory to just kind of break the souls of Minnesota.
Yes. I can't think of the last time I have even heard of someone scoring 9 goals in a game.
Yeah,
I love it.
It was so bad where midway through the second period, Minnesota had to change goalkeepers because we were just schooling them so incredibly bad.
You do feel for that kid. I mean, he's got to be heartbroken.
Nah, I don't feel for him. Going into Saturday, a little different story, a lot tighter of a game.
The Gophers found a little fight in them.
They did. Ended up being 3-3 after 3 periods and overtime.
Yeah.
But the Spartans were able to win the shootout, get that extra point in the standings, taking 5 of the 6 possible points in this series, kind of getting separation now between first and second in the Big Ten standings. And Michigan State is just a wagon and continues to dominate.
Definitely. Women's basketball, talk about continuing that wagon. They are now 7-2 in Big Ten play. They've won 5 in a row, picking up 4 in a row against Penn State at home with almost like a 20-point victory, making it look easy. And then your Lady Spartans went on the road against rivals U of M, Wolverines, and beat them by 30. Yes, you heard me correctly. 30 points at U of M. Julia Ayrault with an absolute dominant performance. She put up 18 points, 13 rebounds, 4 assists, and 3 blocks.
She continues just to be a dominant player for the Spartans.
Oh, my word. It's the first time that a Spartan women's basketball player has put up a double-double against Michigan since Aerial Powers in 2015, which might not sound that long ago, but that was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Like you said, she is just absolutely phenomenal. Theron Halleck put up 25 points against Michigan, and it was a pretty tight game through the first half. The women came out and went on a 10-0 run in the third period. 15-0 run in the third period. Holy cow. The girls have just been absolutely dominating, and there's nothing more that I love than a good U of M beatdown, especially on their home court. And they look to have like a couple more winnable games coming up, correct?
Absolutely. And I think this wasn't any like slouch of a Michigan team either. This was the first time actually that the 2 programs have matched up where both teams are ranked. So the women went on the road.
All of program history.
And knocked out the number 24 team in the country by 30 points.
Yeah, that is wild. And I am absolutely here for it. And I love, it's just, again, we keep saying this, but it's just so fun having such dominant basketball and just overall Spartan sports right now.
Absolutely. The women's gymnastics team had a meet on Friday night against number 20th, Ohio State, and pulled away with the victory. They're continuing their top 10 season as they continue just to perform really well, performing well on the road. Men's tennis defeated Kentucky on Saturday. These weekends have just been jam-packed with Spartan sports. I know on Saturday alone we had...
Not just Spartan sports, Spartan wins.
We had
which we love.
Women's basketball at noon, dominating Michigan. We had men's basketball at 1:30, winning at Madison Square Garden.
Love it.
We had Michigan State taking care of Minnesota in a shootout on Saturday night. Like just all day Spartan domination from sunrise to sundown. And it's not just this weekend. This has been like multiple weekends that this has happened.
I feel like deja vu recording this podcast because we just keep saying the same things every week, and I am here for it. Absolutely.
I know. It's been a long time since we've had to cover a loss for really any of our teams. So hopefully when we're losing, you'll still listen to us. Yes. Hopefully we're still enjoyable, but
don't go anywhere.
We're not planning on that happening anytime soon.
No.
All right, guys. Well, we're here for a very special We Got It Covered segment for you this week. We are joined by Anthony Garvert. You know him as maybe the real Shardy on social media, but Anthony is a contributor over at Spartan Shadows, and he's going to share a little bit of his expertise and knowledge when it comes to advanced metrics. I know especially this time of year when you're watching the broadcast, maybe seeing it on social media, you see a lot of these rating systems that are thrown out there, such as Ken Palm, Bart, Torvik, net, all these things. And they're meaningful because they really directly impact a team's seeding come March, but they can be kind of confusing on just a first glance when you're kind of getting thrown all these names and ratings at you. So Anthony kind of reached out to us and wanted to kind of break these down a little bit for us to kind of help us understand what these rating systems mean, how they're calculated. That way, you guys have got it as well. So, how are you doing, Anthony?
Yeah, guys, thanks for having me on the show. Big fan of you guys, and you have a great setup with like the cozy fire. I feel like everyone says it, but like actually
No, I
seeing it,
love
it's
it.
like
Thank
okay,
you.
this is totally like it's a great vibe with everything.
Well, and I'm, really grateful for our marriage's sake too that you're on, because I will say this morning we definitely got into like a 30-minute plus, like a little bit heated, like voices were starting to get raised because we were getting into it over like Ken Palm, Bart, Torvik, like how the predictive measures work. And so I'm glad. I'm ready to like buckle in and just learn for this whole segment.
Well, it's fun for me too. Like, so my wife is like not that much interested into MSU sports, so like to see a married couple that's like really into it is a fun it's a fun dynamic for sure.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, it's fun. Sometimes it's like you said, heated, but overall, especially these last couple weeks, it's been fun when the
Yes.
winning is happening.
Makes it pretty
Yeah,
easy.
It's
times are
usually
good.
when the
Right,
losses
thanks.
happen when we
Yeah.
start to butt heads a little bit. But yeah, maybe just kind of start giving us like a 30,000 point of view of like advanced metrics, how they're calculated, maybe like why they're important.
Yeah, so I've been following college basketball for pretty much since I was in early grade school, middle school, and I wasn't I would look at box scores every so often, the basic stuff, the points, the rebounds, but I didn't really get too much into like the analytics of it. It wasn't really until I got to college where I started, I found out about some of these advanced analytics guys. There's two of them that are pretty prominent. Ken Pomeroy, which abbreviated as Ken Pom, and then Bart Torvik, which is people just call it Torvik. So those two websites kind of came onto the scene in the last, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years and have really risen to prominence in the college basketball world. And so what they really specialize in is called tempo-free statistics. So when college basketball teams play, there's a lot of different stylistic differences in how teams play. So, some teams play faster or slower. Some teams really like to push the ball. Some teams like to just be content being in half court. And so when that happens, certain statistics can kind of get skewed. Some teams might turn over the ball more frequently because they play more quickly. Some teams may not average as many points per game because they just play in the half court and they like to bleed out the shot clock. So what these tempo-free statistics do is basically allow you to account for that and measure up two teams that maybe are stylistically really different and see how they would play against each other. And on a neutral court, how would these two teams fare, and just trying to predict that in as unbiased of a way as possible.
I actually didn't realize that kind of the base of both of these metrics was kind of that aspect of tempo free.
Yeah.
So that's a interesting point. Yeah.
So there's like a kind of a key baseline to all of these statistics, which is points per possession. It's a pretty simple stat to calculate. So you take how many points a team scores in a game, and then you divide it by the number of times that they possess the ball. And then that gives you a points per possession number. For a lot of these websites, what they'll typically do is they'll multiply that number by 100 and say, this is how many points per possession if the team had 100 possessions. It just makes the number a little more readable. So when you see a team has 125 points per possession, that's per 100 possessions, and it makes the number a little easier to read.
Gotcha.
So when you're calculating points per possession, a possession can end in really one of three ways. It can end with a team coming away with points, be it on a 2-pointer, a 3-pointer, or free throws. It can end in a missed shot, or it can end in a turnover. So, an offensive foul or turning the ball over. So those are really the three ways that a possession can end. So with that, a point per possession number that you would expect to be about average is about 1 point per every possession. And that's kind of average. So if you see a team that has a number that's above 1, the higher it is above 1, the much better the number is. So like 1.2 would be a really good points per possession number. And then conversely on defense, if you're allowing less than 1 point per possession, usually 0.7 or 0.8 are like really elite numbers when you're looking at points per possession allowed.
Okay.
And is that how, and maybe you'll get into this, that you start then looking at like offensive and defensive efficiency? Is that based off of that points per possession?
That's exactly right. So I can get into Ken Pom and Torvik and kind of how they came to be, but typically what they'll do is they'll look at how efficient is a team with the possessions that they do have. So, there have historically been some teams, and Wisconsin under the Bo Ryan years was one of them. Not super fast pace, but he was a big proponent of points per possession. Didn't have a ton of possessions per game, but they didn't turn the ball over much, and they typically were really efficient in scoring when they had the ball in their hands. So with this, you take a team's basically what's called their offensive efficiency, and there are a couple tweaks, relative to whether a team is home or away within these algorithms that basically say if a team performs at home, it won't give as much value to the offensive efficiency. It'll reduce it by it's 1.4%, I think, if they're playing at home, and then they'll give it a boost 1.4% if it's an away game. So they'll adjust the efficiency for that specific game, the points per possession, depending on where the location of it is. And then they average out all of the games over the season, and that is your adjusted offensive efficiency average for the season.
Okay.
That makes sense.
When you see adjusted O, it's that they take every single game's offensive efficiency and then average that number, and then that's the number you come up with.
And so that's why you would see maybe a team take a bigger jump in one of those ratings because they had a great performance on the road versus at home, and you maybe jump 1 or 2 spots versus kind of maybe can jump maybe a handful of spots if you have that efficiency on the road.
That makes sense.
Yep, that's exactly right. So they do this with the adjusted offensive efficiency, and then they also do it with the defensive efficiency. So teams have a ranking, adjusted offensive versus defensive. And then what is the kind of the summation total is what's called the efficiency margin. So that is subtracting your defensive efficiency from your offensive and just what's the difference between those numbers. So the bigger that number is, the bigger your efficiency margin is, the more efficient you are on both sides of the floor, right? The bigger difference you are, more elite you are, the higher that number is.
This is so helpful. I think I'm someone that gets really intimidated by these. So just your clear breakdown of how this is actually calculated out is so helpful. And I really hope our listeners find it that way too. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
So then when Ken Pom puts his site together, there's what they call the 4 factors. So these are 4 other statistics that can kind of play into how a team, how efficient they are. So the 4 factors are turnover percentage, which is how, the percentage of possessions where a team loses the ball before scoring. Effective field goal percentage, which basically measures a team's shooting efficiency, but it gives a little extra boost to 3-point shooting. So unfortunately for Michigan State this year, three-point shooting hasn't been very good. So our effective field goal percentage doesn't look as good.
Okay.
The third factor is offensive rebounding percentage. So the percentage of available rebounds that a team secures. So that accounts for tempo, because if there's fewer rebounds total available, it looks at the percentage of those that you get rather than just how many offensive rebounds per game.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
And then consequently, on the flip side, defensive rebound percentage. MSU is very good in both of those categories. They're number 1 in offensive rebounding in the conference and number 2 in defensive rebounding percentage this year.
That's great. So surprising to me because I feel like we've talked about this a lot on the podcast. I'm a very emotional fan. I feel like we never get offensive rebounds. And so just hearing that is oh, wow, okay, we are actually doing good. And that's a good check and balance on myself.
When thinking of the offensive rebounding percentage, if you were to say miss a shot, get off the rebound, does that still count under the same possession, or does that kind of start a new possession?
That's a good question.
So it counts within the same possession, right? So
Okay.
you're still possessing the ball, and it's that trip down the floor. It's not until you miss the shot and then the ball goes to the other team that the possession is considered concluded.
Would change. Okay.
Right. So that's kind of why Michigan State has still kind of ranked decently well, probably in offensive efficiency, because even though their effective field goal percentage isn't very high, they have that high offensive rebound percentage, which kind of helps balance out that not great shooting percentage.
Yep, exactly. And then the fourth factor that Ken Palm will use in his calculations is free throw rate, which is the percentage of shots that a team takes that are free throws. So basically, how often does a team get to the free throw line? Not necessarily conversion rate, but it is how often, like what percentage of the shots you take are free throws. And MSU is actually number one in the conference in their free throw rate, if you could believe that.
Yeah.
It's something that we're not used to having, but I've been loving it this season.
Right,
totally.
Yes.
And to MSU's credit, when they get to the free throw line, they've been elite. Like they're top 3 in the country in free throw percentage. So they really are. They're making the most of their possessions, I think, as they can. So one thing that kind of, I think a lot of people maybe have some issue with in a lot of these advanced metrics is much like, the AP rankings that come out, way too early, or preseason rankings. Once you start having data, how do you account for that, right? Is there a preseason bias to these numbers? Because once a team starts playing, you learn a lot of new things about them that maybe you didn't know before. So one thing that both of these metrics will do is they actually have there's a certain threshold of games. I think it's roughly 13 games where they actually throw out all the preseason data and they strictly go off of the games that have been played from that point forward, because they have enough of a data set to actually make conclusions about what a team can do on the court.
So up until those 13 games of the season, maybe that data is a little biased or a little bit skewed. But after that 13 game point, you're getting data from just this season. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
So I don't know exactly. There's nuances to it where I don't know exactly. Maybe they start weighing the preseason rating a little bit less and less as you get closer to that 13. But really, once you've passed that threshold, preseason is a thing of the past at this point.
Okay.
You have all the data you need to really start putting these rankings together for analytics sake.
And does that preseason data that they kind of include early in the season, is that kind of based off of the previous season, just like by and large? So even if a team has 8 or 9 different guys, they're still kind of going by the same data of that team from last year?
So, I mean, they have to account for what the returning production is, right? So if you're losing all of your scoring and rebounding production, it's going to be hard to forecast what a team can do. You can estimate it, to the best of your ability, but like there have been years where they expected certain players to be more contributors than they were, and they weren't. So, there's a bit of it's an imperfect science to really try to rank a team in the preseason. So, maybe there's something to be said. We shouldn't put out any rankings until game 12, but us people who like to see those analytics rankings every week don't like that. So they put them out anyway.
No, totally. Yeah. I mean, I'm criminal at, always looking at all of these ratings and stuff. So I totally get kind of the desire, or like
the entertainment factor of it. Yeah.
Lack of credibility that some of these ratings maybe have early in the season, but it evens itself out by the end of the season. So I think it gives the fans what they want in the long run.
Definitely.
Guilty as charged on that front. But to take half a step back and talk more about the two individuals who are putting these together. So the first is Ken Pomeroy. So his data goes all the way back to 2002 when he started tracking this stuff.
Wow.
His background is actually in atmospheric science. I think his undergrad was Virginia Tech, and then he was at Wyoming for a bit, and Utah for a bit. But he was a meteorologist for the U.S. government and just really liked statistics and numbers, and had a kind of a side passion for college basketball. Eventually, he ended up quitting his government job and just to start running his website. So he's just this huge analytics guru, super fan who just made, tracking advanced statistics his full-time profession.
That's wild.
Sounds like a dream come true.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, it's great.
I wish I knew math, but I do not.
And then the other guy, Bart Torvik, he's actually an attorney. I think he focuses on personal injury and foodborne illness. So years of experience in the litigation field, went to law school, University of Minnesota. I think his data starts in 2008, but it's, again, it's all, these are people who just have other professions, but have just really have this side passion for, for statistics. So a couple other things that I think are interesting nuances to keep in mind, similar to like the preseason, a couple other things that, weigh into how these rankings go week over week. One of the things that's taken into account is what's called garbage time. So if a team is blowing another team out and, for the last 5 minutes of the game, they put in their second or their third stringers and they're just, it's the scrubs on the floor for 5 minutes. And all of a sudden a 30-point game turns into a 15-point game. What this does is it basically takes into account that garbage time and said like, well, they were up 30 at one point. Now they're not. Like it throws out the last 4 minutes of a game that's already well decided. It doesn't hold that against a team.
Yeah, that's good to know. I feel like I've always maybe like been frustrated in a game where maybe Michigan State's in that position where they're kind of dominating, maybe up by 20 or 30 points.
Like, how is this going to affect... like Selection Sunday. How does that get taken into account?
Right.
Where maybe instead of being a 20-point victory, it's a 10 or 12-point victory. Right. So
with that said, they do still look at the spread. So like if you're under the spread like that, that is still factored. Like margin of victory is taken into account overall. But I think, if there's like tweaks to how it handles garbage time. One of the other things is, if a game is expected to be a mismatch, right? If we're playing, Furman in the first game of the season and it's, a 30-point spread and we beat them by 40, the value of the game goes down if it's already expected to be a mismatch. So if you are expected to win by 30 and you win by 30, it doesn't weigh that game that much in your favor because you did exactly what you were supposed to do against an opponent that you were already going to blow out.
I think that helps me understand because I think you recently put out an article on Spartans Illustrated just looking at like if the tournament were to be seeded today, like what does the NCAA selection committee look at? And I think one of the things you were talking about that MSU has like the highest score, and you'll probably be able to remember it better than me, was the home game against Nebraska. And on the one hand, it feels like, okay, yeah, we blew Nebraska out, but like it was Nebraska and it was at home. But if it's one of those games where it's not necessarily expected to be a mismatch and then we're going and winning that game by what, 30?
Yeah, near 30 points, something like that.
Like that makes sense why that one would count so much more than a 30-point win against Monmouth or, one of those early teams that we played this season.
So it's interesting. They handle it a little differently in terms of just margin of victory as a total. I think KenPom caps its margin of victory. So if a team's already beaten a team by 20, it doesn't distinguish a 20-point win versus a 30-point win.
Interesting.
Whereas Torvik does. Torvik has doesn't necessarily cap margin of victory. So you'll end up having a wider spread in terms of top to bottom, what the team's efficiency would look like.
Okay. That makes sense.
Whereas KenPom would probably keep it a little bit tighter.
Okay.
Is there other bigger differences between like KenPom and Torvik as far as just like, because obviously if you look at their rating systems, like generally they're pretty similar to each other, but obviously teams are slotted in different spots, maybe by a couple, aside maybe from that margin of victory, like maybe what are some other bigger distinguishers of those two systems?
Yeah, so I think they're very similar to each other. So you're going to see a lot of consistencies between the two and how they're calculating and measuring offensive efficiency. So KenPom is the one who does the home versus away 1.4%. So like that number could look a little bit different and be weighted a little bit different for Torvik. One of the other things that I think the algorithms are maybe slightly different is the importance of games as more days pass. So what KenPom will still, keep a tabulating total of like a team's performance over the season. But say, for instance, a game happened in week 2 of the season, it counts that game as like 60% of what its actual value is. Because the game was so long ago, the team looks so different than what it does now. It doesn't weigh those games. There's a little bit more of a recency bias to it.
Yeah.
And Torvik definitely takes that more into account. So he looks at teams and how, like, what have you done for me lately? And basically saying if a game is older than 40 days old, it caps how important that game could actually be in what we know about a given team.
Okay.
That's so interesting. I mean, we were just talking about that even with the upcoming matchup against Minnesota. We're talking about Michigan State hasn't lost since before we played Minnesota last time. But the Minnesota team that we're about to play on Tuesday looks very different from the Minnesota team that we played back in December. So that makes a lot of sense. And I kind of appreciate that statistic takes that into account.
Right.
So, like, if I asked you guys, if we played Kansas again on a neutral floor with this team we have now, would that result look different now than it would have playing them week 2 of the season when we didn't know our rotation or what we had?
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, that's where my mind first went to. I think we'd have a very different perception going into that game than we did early November.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question has to be asked, okay, well, where does MSU sit in these rankings, right? You know, how do they stack up nationally purely from an analytics standpoint? So this isn't going to correlate to the AP poll in any way. And, maybe it'll be somewhat similar to the net rankings. But what is interesting is that the committee doesn't actually use Torvik or KenPom to determine any of their seeding. It's purely an analytics, visual test thing, but it's not as far as I know, the committee won't seed based on where your team's KenPom rating is. But we still, there's some really strong data points that we can glean from KenPom and Torvik. I'll get to those in a little bit. But where does MSU stack up relative to the Big Ten and relative to the national landscape right now?
Yeah, I think that'd be great to know.
So both of them actually are very similar, both Torvik and KenPom. Torvik currently has MSU as the number 14 efficiency team. And then KenPom has MSU as the number 15 team from an efficiency standpoint. Both of those are 4th in the Big Ten, and both of those have the same 3 teams ahead of them, which is pretty tight, for what it's worth. Torvik has, in this order, Illinois, Purdue, Wisconsin ahead of us, and then KenPom has Purdue, Illinois, Wisconsin ahead of us right now. Which is interesting, right?
Yeah,
we're number 1 in the Big Ten, but why aren't we number 1 from an efficiency standpoint?
Yeah.
So it's not going to, maybe sometimes there's biases or there's things that affect a game that it can't account for. And that's actually one of the biggest, if I could nitpick and find a fault for these, is they don't take the emotional and injury factors into a game.
Yeah.
KenPom and Torvik both assume full strength of a team when they are calculating efficiency. So if, for instance, one of your best players gets into serious foul trouble, it doesn't account for that. If a player's injured, Dylan Harper, right, it doesn't take that into account, right? So it's a bit of an imperfect science in terms of like perfectly predicting how the games are gonna fall.
Yeah.
But for the most part, MSU has been covering their KenPom spreads and doing what they're supposed to be doing in most of these games. There's very few games where they haven't handled the business the way that they should. But we're also not in the meat of the schedule yet. Once they start racking up more of these quad 1 games, right, we'll really start to see that number become more strong as they start playing teams, away from the Breslin and playing more difficult teams that will, give them a better strength of victory, basically.
Right.
And I think there's the emotional side of me that says, how in the world is Illinois ahead of Michigan State in these ratings? Thinking about, the way that we traditionally think about ratings and like the AP poll and those sorts of things is based on matchups and wins and losses. As far as like, Michigan State has no losses in the Big Ten, while Illinois has 3 now. And we've beat Illinois 4 in a head-to-head matchup. But when you think about it, that it's based off of offensive and defensive efficiency, it's like, oh man, all right, we got some work to do. And so if we're going to be able to continue to win those games, we've got to continue to improve on those stats.
Yeah.
And to Illinois' credit, they do have some really strong victories. Like if you play a team earlier in the season and you blow the doors off of them, a team that's very good, then that will, that'll make your metrics look really good, because the importance of that game will outweigh any of the, lesser opponents that you played and blew out. So it does give a lot of strength to that. But as the season progresses, water does start to find its level, and you'll see those rankings start to look more like just what the Big Ten standings are.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a good point in Illinois too. Like, they do have a pretty semi-recent blowout on the road against Oregon, who I know both KenPom and Torvik are pretty high on as well, where I don't know exactly what the spread was going in that game, but I would assume Oregon was probably favored in that game, and they went in and beat them by 30.
Yep.
So kind of based off that expectant outcome,
Yeah.
they blew that out of the water.
Yeah.
Right. So, and Purdue obviously got a huge jump this week because they went against a ranked Michigan team and they did what teams, what happens to teams at Mackey. They just go there and it's a house of horror. So,
right.
they got a big bump this week because they blew out a ranked opponent. So, the best thing that MSU can do, one, is continuing to win the games that they're supposed to win. But if you have that ranked opponent and you're well ahead of them, don't let them back into it. Don't let the metrics, be fooled by what actually happened in that game. So it's hard. It's really hard to win in the Big Ten, but it's really hard to blow good teams out. That's a hard thing to do.
Totally.
So really the last interesting point about KenPom specifically is there's a really interesting statistic about teams that have, measured up well in KenPom and how they do on the national landscape, particularly as we come to March.
Which I think is super helpful to look at because, like you said, the NCAA selection committee doesn't actually look at KenPom or Bart Torvik. So there's this little devil's advocate in me that's kind of well, so what? But I think that's the important thing of how has that factored into deep March runs in the past?
Right. And Carter actually mentioned it on the pod last week, which was great. I'm like, this is perfect. The segue is great into the segment for this week. So he mentioned that MSU currently has a top 25 ranked adjusted offensive and adjusted defensive efficiency. Both of those are ranked in the top 25 right now. So the statistic is KenPom has 23 seasons of basketball data. 22 of those have resulted in a March Madness tournament. We throw out the COVID year. So 22 seasons of data. In 21 of those seasons, a team that won the national title had a top 25 offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency.
Okay.
21 out of 22 seasons, the team was elite offensively and elite defensively.
Yeah.
There's one exception to that. Actually, I'll throw it out there. Do you know who the holdout is?
Oh, man.
I was just trying to rack my brain to think who that might be.
I'll give you a hint. MSU played them. This person won the national title.
Was it 2014 UConn?
That is exactly who it was. It was 2014 UConn. They were the number 39.
I don't know how you have a memory for that. I can't remember one year to the next. That was awesome.
They were number 39 offensively and number 10 defensively.
Okay,
but
interesting.
They just got hot in March.
Right.
And, Shabazz Napier started putting it together and, good guard play in March, and that carried him.
Yeah, interesting.
So
that's definitely an encouraging sign for Spartan fans for sure.
Knowing that we at least have the prerequisite of what you would need
for
to
now
be able to get
least,
to yeah, we'll see how the rest.
So this
of the
is consider this my pro tip. If you're filling out a bracket and you want to know if the team you picked is probably a good one or not, go to KenPom. Yeah. Are they top 25 offensive and defensive? If they are, then it's probably a good bet.
Yeah.
For this year, there are currently 9 teams that fit that mold at the moment.
Interesting. Okay, so that's what I was thinking about because theoretically, if you had teams who were wildly efficient on both sides of the ball, you could have 25 teams who fit that bill. But it's interesting that there's only 9 that sit there now, and it'll be interesting to see by the time we get to Selection Sunday and people are filling out their brackets where that sits. Right. And I love that you brought that up because I just said to Jonah, I think yesterday, I was like, man, I'm gonna get so into filling out. I've had some good brackets in the past, mostly based off of luck, and we'll see if the statistics do good or not this year because I think I'm gonna weigh into them a little bit heavier. Watch, I'll have the worst bracket I've ever had this year or something.
And I know that it's a silly, it's kind of a no-brainer stat. Of course, the team that wins it all is going to be good offensively and good defensively, but it is so strong of a correlation that every single year, even if there's some upsets and parity and things going on in the early rounds, the best teams do end up making it to the middle. And even if it's not necessarily the best team from a efficiency margin standpoint, it's going to be one of, usually between 8 and 10 teams that it's a pretty safe bet on that they're going to be one of the ones that year.
Right. I think that too, like you said, it seemed like a no-brainer, but on the flip side, if you're filling out a bracket, and hopefully your brother-in-law Chris isn't listening to this episode. He's a big Kentucky Wildcats fan. But a team like that, who I think they're at least top 10 offensive efficiency, but I think they're like in the hundreds defensively.
Yeah.
You might see them as a top 2 or 3 seed and say, hey, they're a good sleeper pick. But because the defense is pretty bad, they're probably not a good team to end up picking, even though they have that elite offense.
And if you're like an average Joe like me that's filling out your bracket on ESPN, or like growing up, we would use the newspaper, right? And you've got the like 2-sentence blurb about that team, and they talk about like, oh, this 10 team tends to get really like hot from 3 in March, or like these different things. And you're trying to weigh those different things out against, okay, this team is supposed to be really great offensively, but they're playing another team that has, this awesome defensive, guard play that they've got going on. Like, those sort of things, I think, really help you parse that all out.
Totally.
Yeah, that was really all I had on advanced statistics. I mean, I think it's something you can always learn more about. If I could plug Ken Pom and Torvik, they're both fantastic people. They're really they really want to make their information accessible. They do have subscriptions as well, so I'm not a sponsor for them, but like I totally support.
No, absolutely.
Small business media and like people who are putting these stats together. It's a lot of work to do it. So I greatly appreciate, and hats off to them for doing all this. Right?
Yeah, totally. Like awesome how much of that information is provided for free. So as us as subscribers and people who get way too into college basketball, clearly like it's awesome to be able to give back to that community and just like continue to support that data being shared for sure.
Right, and it's even cool to see like even though like you said the committee doesn't use those for seeding, I do believe they still like when kind of comparing teams, that's on a team's sheet is Ken Pom and Torvik rating. So like It's cool to see. It's not only like helping the fans, but it's honestly helping the committee as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and you see it on TV too. When on TV, when they throw up a team that's on the bubble, usually they'll put their Ken Pom number on there, even though the committee won't outright say that they use it.
Yeah.
I find it hard to believe that they don't at least give it a glance if there's two teams that they're kind of up in the air about.
Yes. Yeah. Or even like the statistics that go into that rank. Like all those things are factoring into how teams get seeded for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for joining us today. I know for at least me, and I'm sure Abby as well, and all of our listeners, it was super helpful. I think all of us will have it covered a little bit more now when we kind of hear these statistics, or now want to look it up on our own to kind of see where Michigan State or the other teams kind of stack up when it comes to these advanced metrics. But yeah, you broke it down really well for us, I think.
Just use Ken Pom in conversation and everyone will instantly trust you more, right?
Yes.
Makes you sound smarter immediately.
Absolutely, yeah.
If I do well in my bracket this year, I finished in the top 100 before. So if I do that again, all credit goes to you, for real. I love it. Well, thanks for joining us. If you ever want to be entertained during Spartan games, you should definitely follow The Real Shardy on Twitter or Blue Sky. It's always a good time. He's always got some great takes for sure.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me on. It was a lot of fun.